Mumbai, late afternoon. The sky, covered in warm shades of orange and rust, clashed with the frantic energy of the streets. Lines of cars jerked forward. Motorbikes weaved through narrow gaps in traffic. Street vendors balanced trays full of spices, as scattered shouts and deafening horns created the city's soundtrack. It was another day where chaos seemed to triumph over order, and the gray horizon of the metropolis blended with the scent of burnt oil, curry, and urban dust. Inside a luxury car with tinted windows and a climate-controlled interior, Brandon Hayes watched everything from within a world that didn't match the one outside. His tailored suit still held the perfect crease in the sleeves, but the tired expression on his face revealed the weight of the past few days. At 38, Brandon was the picture of success, a billionaire, an American, owner of a tech empire that had expanded into the Asian market with unusual strategic aggression. His face was always stern, his gaze cold, calculating, and at that moment, despite the comfort of the car, the discomfort within him was consuming more than the city's sweltering heat. Hours earlier, he had left a meeting that didn't go as expected. Local executives questioned his decisions, investors asked for caution, and his authority, though usually undisputed, had been challenged for the first time in a long while. The sting to his pride echoed inside him like a muffled drumbeat. He hated being contradicted, and even more, appearing vulnerable. He ordered the driver to leave him alone. He needed to drive, to control something with his own hands, even if it was just the steering wheel of a car. As he pulled away from the commercial center and took the elevated road crossing the Mithi River, the sky gradually darkened. The navigation system was muted, the radio remained off, and his phone, tossed on the passenger seat, kept vibrating with messages and missed calls. Brandon kept his eyes straight ahead, ignoring all of them, until the screen lit up with a familiar name. His arm moved almost instinctively. He reached for the device, looked away for just a second, and the world shifted. The screech of tires on damp asphalt was followed by a dry, brutal impact. The car spun out of control, crashed into the side barrier, and slid toward the edge of the bridge. The windshield shattered into 1,000 pieces, and Brandon's body was hurled violently against the dashboard. In seconds, the city's noise seemed to vanish. No horns, no metallic sounds, just the steady hum of an alarm. And then, silence. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the sky, now a deep blue, began to reveal the first stars. The car remained still, its hood steaming and engine groaning in defeat. Slowly, people gathered at the bridge's edge, watching the scene with horror and silent curiosity. A phone was raised. Within minutes, images of the crash spread through local social media. Ambulances arrived with strobe lights reflecting in puddles, and uniformed men ran toward the vehicle. Brandon was pulled from the wreckage by paramedics, who moved with urgency and precision. Blood trickled down the side of his face, staining the collar of his white shirt. His eyes were closed, arms limp, body lifeless, as if his soul had slipped away through the same tear in the shredded tire. He was placed on a stretcher with great care, and even unconscious, his name passed between the medical team in awed whispers. They recognized him instantly, the American billionaire who had appeared in newspapers, business summits, and philanthropic campaigns in partnership with elite hospitals. He wasn't just another crash victim. He was someone whose fate would mobilize authorities, media, and corporations alike. On the way to the hospital, Brandon's vital signs fluctuated. The ambulance siren pierced through Mumbai's heavy air, making way through the congested avenues. Night fell harder, wrapping the city in a humid, warm haze. Outside, life carried on, indifferent. Inside the vehicle, a silent battle had begun. Upon arrival at a private hospital in Bandra, one of the most modern in the city, a team of specialists was already waiting. The stretcher glided swiftly through brightly lit hallways, cutting through silent wings until reaching the surgical unit. The initial diagnosis pointed to cranial trauma, multiple fractures, and temporary loss of consciousness. The doctors acted with surgical precision, stabilizing the patient and transferring him to an exclusive suite equipped with the best resources modern medicine could offer. However, despite all the technology, one relentless uncertainty remained. No one knew when or if Brandon would wake up. As the heart monitor beeped steadily, the ventilator screen displayed the dependency of a body that, not long ago, commanded entire corporations with the swipe of a finger. Now, every beat of his heart was sustained by wires, tubes, and intensive care. In the hospital lobby, journalists began to gather. Social media buzzed with speculation, and his company's spokespersons issued formal statements requesting privacy and respect. But none of those reactions mattered inside the darkness surrounding Brandon. In the space between what was and what ceased to be, he hovered. The man used to commanding the world now lay in a cold bed, breathing with the help of machines, while outside, the city pulsed with the same intensity that ignored the silence of his absence. And so, amid artificial lights, soft alarms, and the hum of medical equipment, darkness took over. There was no more image, only blackness, and within it, the beginning of a new story. While Brandon Hayes' body remained motionless in the sterile bed of the private wing, sustained by machines and surrounded by technology, the hospital's routine continued with a subtle and silent order. The hallways, lit by cold fluorescent lights, received the constant flow of doctors, nurses, and staff who, accustomed to the almost robotic rhythm of hospital life, moved discreetly. Along the sides of the corridors, tall vases with ornamental plants helped create an atmosphere of artificial calm, as if trying to soften the invisible weight that the presence of illness and death imposed on that place. It was in that meticulously controlled environment that Lily Parker appeared, almost imperceptibly. With her hair tied in a simple bun and the clean uniform of a cleaning staff member, she moved through the hospital wings with light, quiet steps, as if she wished never to be noticed. At 24 years old, her face carried an unusual blend of serenity and resilience. Born in the United States, she had spent much of her childhood in a small town, but after her mother fell ill and passed away suddenly, Lily traveled to India to live with her maternal grandmother. The elderly woman, deeply rooted in local traditions, welcomed her granddaughter with quiet tenderness, teaching her to respect life's cycles and to find strength in simplicity. Since arriving in Mumbai, Lily faced challenges with humility. Although she dreamed of becoming a nurse, she knew the path would be long and filled with obstacles. While she studied on her own with borrowed books and watched class videos whenever time allowed, she accepted the job as a cleaner at the private hospital in Bandra as a first step toward her goal. She understood that being there, even with a mop in hand, was a way to be closer to what she longed for. Her shift began before dawn. She walked through long, still empty corridors, cleaned floors that would soon be hurriedly crossed by doctors, and disinfected doorknobs and surfaces with the precision of someone who understood the importance of every action. She wasn't noticed by many. Most people saw her as part of the background, just another functional element among many. But Lily observed everything. She had a keen eye for details others ignored. The way a nurse adjusted the blanket of an unconscious patient, the distant look of a visitor in the lobby cafe, or the hidden exhaustion on the face of a resident on duty. That particular night, while retrieving a cleaning bucket from the second-floor supply room, something unusual happened. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway, and then an emergency door burst open. A medical team was pushing a stretcher at full speed. Lily instinctively stepped aside and pressed against the wall, allowing them to pass. Her curious eyes discreetly followed the scene. The man on the stretcher had his face partially covered by an oxygen mask, his chest marked with sensors and electrodes. The white sheet revealed only part of his body, but what caught her attention most was his empty expression. Even unconscious, something in that face seemed to scream in silence. For a few seconds, Lily couldn't look away. She couldn't explain why, but she felt a pang in her chest, a kind of silent unease. It was as if she had been pulled into that moment by an invisible force. That didn't happen often. Over time, she had witnessed many serious cases being rushed through there, but none had touched her like this. As soon as the doctors disappeared into another wing, she continued on her way, still affected by that strange feeling, as if she had just witnessed the beginning of something greater than she could understand. In the staff cafeteria, the buzz spread quickly. People spoke of a powerful American involved in a car accident. His name passed from mouth to mouth in hushed, reverent tones. Brandon Hayes. Some recognized his face from news articles. Others just knew he controlled companies that had heavily invested in the country's tech infrastructure. To Lily, he wasn't just another famous face. He was the unconscious man who had crossed her path moments earlier, whose closed eyes seemed to carry an entire world in silence. The next morning, the routine returned to its usual pace. Lily started her shift earlier than normal. The sky still showed pale blue tones faded by the rising sun. The corridors were quieter, and the sound of her own footsteps echoed between the walls. As she passed by the private wing, she noticed that one of the suites was under tighter surveillance. The door remained slightly ajar, revealing part of a heart monitor blinking in a steady rhythm. Inside the room, Brandon's presence was almost symbolic, his body motionless, the sheets precisely arranged, the soft hum of the machines filling the space. That was the first of many silent encounters. Lily, without really knowing why, began bringing fresh flowers bought from a small stand near the train station. They were simple arrangements, sometimes made with white chrysanthemums or small orange blossoms. She left them discreetly in a vase in the anteroom, unnoticed by anyone. She also began cleaning the floor of that wing more frequently, making sure the American patient's room was always spotless, even though it was an area maintained by another team. The most curious gesture, however, came about spontaneously. One afternoon, while emptying a trash bin near the suite's entrance, Lily softly whispered a mantra she had heard many times from her grandmother. The melody was gentle, repetitive, almost like an ancient lullaby. She didn't expect anyone to hear it, much less understand it, but she felt that the sound filled the room in a different way, as if it brought comfort not only to herself, but also to that unconscious man, lost between life and darkness. In the following days, she continued the ritual. Each time she cleaned the space, she left a new flower, murmured a small story about the neighborhood where she lived, or quietly described the movements of the community garden where she helped her grandmother on weekends. There was no logic to her actions, no reward. There was only a growing feeling of empathy, of an invisible connection that defied reason. Meanwhile, her presence remained almost imperceptible to others. She didn't wear a prominently displayed badge, didn't appear on the visitor logs, nor did she have formal authorization to be there. Even so, her presence settled into that space like a constant breeze, light, silent, and transformative. Lily didn't know exactly what was driving her, but something within her was blooming gently. Something that didn't rely on recognition, only on presence and attention. And it was in that silence, filled with intention, that she drew near, not as someone expecting something in return, but as a soul that had recognized another, even without understanding why. Time continued its course within that luxurious hospital in Bandra, where days passed with the repetitive precision of a silent clock. Lily Parker's presence, though constant, remained nearly invisible to those who circulated there. She continued her subtle care for Brandon Hayes, not out of duty, but from a connection that seemed to transcend rational understanding. Every gesture she made upon entering the quiet suite carried a delicacy that contrasted with the clinical coldness of the environment. Nothing about her cried out, nothing demanded to be seen, and yet, her presence became increasingly essential in that space where life remained suspended. Brandon's body, immobilized between sheets, reacted in subtle ways that would go unnoticed by distracted eyes. The heart monitor, with its steady signals, remained stable. The expression on his face, once entirely still, gradually gained a subtle softness during Lily's silent visits. She continued bringing fresh flowers, almost always simple, bought from the same market where she purchased vegetables with her grandmother. Discreetly, she would place them on the suite's side table, replacing the old ones without drawing attention. She also brought small sachets filled with dried scented leaves she had learned to prepare from her grandmother, leaving them quietly beside the pillows or near the headboard, as if hoping the soft aroma might reach his unconscious mind, piercing the invisible veil of the coma. On certain quieter afternoons, when the hospital's movement slowed and outside noise didn't reach the private wing, Lily connected her small phone to a portable speaker hidden among her belongings. She played calm music, instrumental melodies mixed with natural forest sounds and traditional Indian songs. The soft notes filled the space with harmony, creating a welcoming atmosphere that contrasted with the sterile feel of other areas. On those occasions, she allowed herself to sit for a few minutes in the chair next to the bed and, in a low voice, narrated fragments of her day, what she had seen on her morning walk, something funny she'd heard at the market, or even a childhood memory that surfaced without explanation. Her words had no confirmed recipient, but they were offered with a quiet hope that, somehow, he might absorb them. As the weeks passed, these moments became part of a secret routine. Lily never crossed any boundaries. She never touched him beyond adjusting a pillow or straightening a sheet. Still, her attention was constant, and her care wasn't limited to the physical. She nourished that room with human presence, with selfless affection, with a tenderness that didn't depend on acknowledgement. It was as if her soul was entirely present there, even though her body remained respectfully distant. It was in this setting that a new figure arrived, breaking the silent balance Lily had built. Chloe Madison came in like a storm disguised as a breeze. At 35, she carried a calculated elegance. Her hair was always perfectly styled, her clothes impeccable, her perfume bold, and her posture firm. She worked as a public relations specialist for major events, used to cameras, microphones, and the performance of appearances she mastered with ease. Upon hearing of Brandon's accident, she made it a point to show up, not to offer genuine support, but to reinforce her connection to the powerful name now lying unconscious in a hospital bed. From the very first day, Chloe treated the hospital like a stage set for a personal performance. Entering the private wing, she handed out reserved smiles, greeted nurses with forced politeness, and requested carefully posed photos beside Brandon's bed. In one image, she held his hand with a dramatic expression. In another, she pretended to pray at his bedside, eyes half closed. The social media posts came quickly. Well-crafted captions accompanied the images. Still by his side, love survives time and pain, strength and faith always. Reactions were immediate. Emotional followers, mass likes, comments praising her courage and devotion. But the moment the camera stopped recording, her expression changed. The visits became brief, punctual, often marked by impatience. Instead of looking at Brandon with tenderness, she studied her own reflection in the window glass or checked notifications on her phone. She brought expensive flowers, grand arrangements delivered by couriers with gold ribbons, but didn't place them with care. She simply handed them off to support staff. If the nurses replaced or discarded them, she never noticed. Her focus was always on maintaining an image, not on the real well-being of the man she claimed to love. Chloe treated the hospital as an extension of her controlled environment, a stage where she needed to play the role of the loyal woman. In her rare interactions with the staff, she maintained a distant cordiality, as if she were above them. She didn't bother to ask about clinical details, nor did she understand medical terms, though she pretended interest when someone tried to explain his condition. What mattered was seeming present, seeming devoted, seeming involved. With every new visit from Chloe, Lily withdrew. The two never crossed paths directly, but something in the air shifted when Chloe was near. The room seemed to lose some of the softness Lily had left behind. The music stopped. The scent of the flowers was drowned out by the strong, imported perfume. Even without words, Lily could feel the stark contrast between one woman's intentions and the other's. And though she didn't judge, she clearly understood that whatever existed between Brandon and Chloe lived only on the surface of appearances, not in the essence of care. The days went on, and while Brandon remained unconscious, his body still trapped in that deep sleep, two worlds moved around him without ever touching. On one side, Chloe crafted a narrative for the outside world. On the other, Lily kept a silent flame alive, one that asked for no recognition. One cared for appearances, the other cared for the soul. Over time, Brandon's vital signs began to stabilize more consistently. The doctors made no promises, but noted that his condition was holding steady. Few noticed that when Lily was present, the atmosphere in the room seemed calmer. Brandon's expression softened. There was something about her presence that reorganized the space, even if there was no scientific explanation for it. The difference between Lily's and Chloe's visits lay in the absence of performance. Lily never sat to pose. She never took pictures. She never raised her voice. She simply remained. She simply cared. Her giving was anonymous. Her affection sought no audience. Meanwhile, Chloe continued to cultivate her digital presence, using Brandon's coma as a convenient storyline to gain visibility. She posted emotional texts about second chances, about hope, about unconditional love, but her eyes, when they looked at the unconscious man, never reflected the feelings her words promised. It was in that brutal contrast that the conflicts began to take shape. Although Brandon was not awake, his presence was intensely felt by both women. Chloe became increasingly demanding, insisting on being called his official partner and requesting frequent updates from the medical team. Lily, on the other hand, stayed in the background. She preferred to remain invisible, just the cleaning girl mopping the floor. But each flower she left, Each song she played, each story she softly narrated took root in that suite, as if she were preparing fertile ground for an awakening with no set date, but one that felt inevitable. Thus, the space around Brandon transformed into a field of invisible forces. On one side, appearance. On the other, essence. Chloe remained convinced that her performance was enough to secure her place by his side, while Lily continued her quiet journey, planting seeds of care in fertile soil, even without knowing if she would ever witness the harvest. And while the city pulsed outside with its chaos and haste, in that still room, time seemed suspended, as if waiting for the right moment to bring Brandon back to consciousness, not just of life, but of everything that truly mattered. Time inside that hospital didn't follow the same rhythm as life beyond its walls. Inside, the days seemed to stretch, dragging along at their own pace, where the hours didn't depend on the clock hands, but on the small changes that revealed themselves in the silent dimness of a room occupied by a sleeping body. Brandon Hayes remained there, motionless at first glance, but not everything within him was still. His face, once entirely rigid, began to show minimal movements, nearly imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention. A slight furrow of the brows at certain moments, a subtle twitch of the lips during the pauses between the songs Lily played. These weren't clinical responses worthy of alarm, but for someone watching with their heart, they were enough to believe that something within him was still responding to the world. Lily Parker noticed these changes naturally, without trying to understand or label them. She continued to visit the suite with the same quiet grace as always, careful not to alter the environment too much so no one would grow suspicious. She mopped the floor like the other cleaning staff, emptied waste bins, reorganized bottles of sanitizer and boxes of disposable gloves. But at some point in the morning or afternoon, she always found a moment to approach the bed, to sit for a few minutes and share her silent presence. The routine between her and Brandon followed a pattern that, though discreet, grew deeper with each day. Lily tended to the lighting with almost maternal care. She adjusted the blinds to let in soft sunlight in the morning, never directly hitting his face. In the afternoon, when Mumbai's heat became oppressive, she made sure the air conditioning was set to a comfortable temperature, not too cold, not too stuffy. She alternated the use of essential oils, keeping the scents light, in tune with the day's mood, and every small gesture was performed with genuine tenderness, as if her presence could balance what the machines and medications still could not. During these moments, Lily spoke, not with the intention of being heard, but with the calm of someone who shares life with someone who, in some way, understands. She talked about what she made for dinner the night before, described a little girl's new dress she saw playing in the street, shared the flavor of a ripe mango she ate with her grandmother. They weren't extraordinary stories. They were simple fragments of daily life, yet they carried the comforting weight of reality. By telling these things, Lily left a bit of herself in that room, as if planting affection among the pillows and white sheets. These subtle interactions seemed to influence Brandon's body. When Lily entered the room, his heart rate showed a slightly more consistent rhythm. The monitor graphs fluctuated in a more harmonious way. The tension in his facial muscles softened. The healthcare professionals, focused on their technical tasks, paid no mind to these details, treating the variations as typical fluctuations of a comatose state. But Lily noticed. She didn't understand the medical terms, but she could read the signals from his body with the same sensitivity she used to know when her grandmother needed tea, or when the rain changed intensity outside. In contrast, Chloe Madison's visits became more spaced out and predictable. After the initial impact of her public appearance, her physical presence was replaced by emails to doctors, calls to hospital administrators, and new social media posts showing her busy life filled with events, recordings, and meetings. Her most recent images included dinners at high-end restaurants, short trips to Dubai, and appearances at business communication conferences. In the background, always a caption referencing her strength during difficult personal times. Her speech kept Brandon at the emotional center, but her true attention had shifted to other interests. When she showed up, Chloe stayed only a few minutes. She wore high heels, expensive handbags, and designer clothes that clashed with the hospital environment. She entered the room, looked at Brandon as if evaluating an old investment. Her words, when spoken, came out hurried and almost automatic. She never touched him. She kept a distance that seemed to avoid any real connection. On certain occasions, she took another photo, always well posed, always from the best angle, Then she left, leaving behind the strong scent of expensive perfume and the emptiness of someone who was never truly there. The nurses noticed the differences but preferred not to comment. The hospital required discretion, and most understood that every family coped with suffering in their own way. Still, some exchanged glances when Lily left the room with bright eyes and a serene expression, while Chloe left with the urgency of someone unwilling to be touched by reality. Little by little, without anyone declaring it, the energy inside that room changed. The space, which once seemed purely functional, now became a quiet refuge. The furniture, the machines, even the scent of the place seemed to absorb Lily's constant presence. Brandon's room, though officially his alone, now carried an invisible imprint left by her. It was as if particles of her devotion had seeped into the walls, filling every corner with a vibration that escaped ordinary perception. And even in a coma, Brandon responded. His heartbeat would settle into a steady rhythm when the music began to play. His fingers would sometimes move slightly during Lily's soft readings. The monitor, though stable, registered fluctuations indicating nervous system responses. To the doctors, these data showed moderate progress with no concrete prognosis. To Lily, they were signs of life. For her, every deeper breath, every subtle contraction of his facial muscles, was a response to the presence she nurtured with consistency and tenderness. That bond, though invisible, began to form the backbone of room 712. Lily never declared her intentions. She didn't claim space. She didn't ask for recognition. But without anyone naming it, she became essential. And Brandon, even immersed in unconsciousness, seemed to accept that presence as part of his staying. It was as if his body understood, at the edge of sleep and wakefulness, that the young woman beside him wanted nothing more than for him to be well. While the outside world spun with its usual haste, that space followed its own rhythm. The city vibrated with a frenetic pace. Cars packed the avenues of Bandra, merchants shouted on the corners, and skyscrapers cast long shadows over narrow alleys. But there, inside the suite, only two presences mattered: the sleeping body that resisted abandonment and the quiet soul that insisted on staying. Lily didn't know if he would wake up. She made no promises, but all her actions carried the certainty that even if nothing changed, she would continue. Because what had grown between the two didn't depend on consciousness. It depended only on presence. And with each passing day, the invisible grew stronger. That morning arrived like any other, silent and thick with the heat building inside the hospital's closed corridors. The windows in the wing where Brandon was hospitalized didn't open for safety, but the glass fogged from the temperature difference revealed the intensity of the tropical climate. Lily, as she had for weeks, entered quietly through the back door of the unit. By now, she knew the exact times when nurses and supervisors switched shifts and used those intervals to reach the patient's room unnoticed. It was a silent, nearly invisible ritual, but deeply filled with intention. That day, something inside her felt more restless. She felt a different pull as she approached his door. It wasn't anxiety or fear. It was a subtle vibration, a kind of unexplained urgency, as if some part of her already knew that this morning would bring something none of the others had. The room was dimly lit, the curtains letting in just a sliver of light that softly illuminated the white sheet covering Brandon's motionless body. The machines next to the bed maintained their continuous, almost hypnotic sounds, and the scent of the fresh flowers Lily had brought the night before still filled the air with a hint of jasmine and mint. She approached slowly, gently adjusted the pillow, checked the position of his hands, and sat in the chair beside him. She pulled from her pocket a small towel embroidered by her grandmother, lightly passed it across his forehead, and then reached for her phone. She searched the audio folder and, without thinking much, pressed play. The song that began to play was an old melody, traditional from the Indian countryside, taught by her grandmother on rainy days when they sheltered on the porch, sipping ginger tea. The voice coming from the phone was Lily's own, recorded days earlier, softly singing lyrics about paths, rebirth, and cycles that close so others may begin. The melody carried a melancholic tone, but there was also a welcoming sweetness to it, almost maternal. It was the same song her grandmother said she sang to Lily's mother on the day she was born, and which, according to ancient beliefs, had the power to protect and awaken sleeping souls. The sound slowly filled the room, as if caressing every corner, The machines continued their regular beeps, but something in the air felt different. Lily herself felt a light shiver rise up her neck and rest on her shoulders, as if invisible hands touched her skin. She moved closer, held his hand firmly, not expecting any reaction, and remained there in complete silence, listening to her own recorded voice while watching the unresponsive face of the man in the bed. She didn't know exactly how long it lasted, only that the beeping on the heart monitor subtly changed its rhythm, a steadier, more present tempo. A faint signal, but one she didn't miss. Her heart raced. Then, almost imperceptibly, Brandon's eyelids moved, a small tremor in his lashes, as if his eyes were trying to find the light beyond the darkness that had enveloped them for so long. His breathing, once mechanical and machine-controlled, showed signs of natural ease. Lily's eyes widened, but she didn't move. She remained still, feeling the temperature of his hand change, warmth slowly returning to his skin. His fingers weakly curled around hers, and even though she couldn't fully believe what she was seeing, she didn't pull back. She stayed still, observing. Then his eyes opened, heavy, dulled from prolonged unconsciousness, but alive. He blinked a few times, trying to adjust to the dim light, to the confusion of images arriving without context. Brandon didn't speak. He had no strength for words, but his eyes searched for something. First the objects around him, then the wires connected to his body, then the ceiling. His breathing intensified, but without panic. It was a slow return, like someone waking from a dream that lasted too long. His eyes finally stopped on Lily's, and even without knowing her, they seemed to recognize something in her. Perhaps the melody still echoing softly, perhaps the touch of her hands, perhaps a memory not yet formed, but present in his soul. Lily said nothing. She simply tightened her grip and let the song finish. Minutes later, a nurse rushed in, alerted by the central system monitoring vital signs. The hallway filled with movement. Doctors appeared, technicians adjusted equipment, and soon a small team formed around the bed. Lily stepped back discreetly, as she always did, and left before anyone noticed her presence. She returned to the locker room, changed clothes, placed the phone in her pocket, and walked down the stairs with her heart pounding. She knew what had just happened, but also knew no one would believe her, and maybe they didn't need to. Meanwhile, Chloe arrived at the hospital shortly after the news spread. She wore a dark dress, oversized sunglasses, and flawless makeup. She walked to the reception desk, and upon being informed of Brandon's recovery, placed her hands on her chest with theatrical emotion. She asked to be taken to him, and upon entering the room, found the doctors still organizing exams and finalizing neurological assessment protocols. As soon as she could, she approached the bed and positioned herself strategically at his side. She placed one hand over his, without noticing how cold and impersonal the touch felt. She ordered an aide to discreetly capture images of the moment. She wanted the world to see her devotion. Within hours, her social media account would display the photo with an emotional caption about faith, love, and miracles. Brandon, still groggy and mentally scattered, vaguely recognized the face in front of him. It was familiar, yet strange. There was something off about her presence. His eyes searched for something that wasn't there. He missed a sound, a voice, a subtle presence that had become part of his subconscious during all that time in darkness. The woman in front of him spoke with enthusiasm, but her voice was sharp, superficial. No connection was formed. It felt like watching a staged play, far removed from his lived reality. When Chloe stepped away, satisfied with the photos taken, Brandon remained silent, staring at the ceiling. His still face held more questions than answers. He felt exhausted, but also restless. Something inside him told him there was much more to the story than what doctors, nurses, or visitors could see. It was as if an essential part of his own memory was hidden, not in facts, but in sensations. The softness of music, the lingering scent of flowers, the touch that warmed his skin. These fragments drifted like shadows through his mind. Nothing was clear, but everything felt real. That same night, while the hospital finally exhaled a breath of relief at the unexpected recovery of the American billionaire, Lily walked through the narrow streets of the neighborhood with a quiet smile on her face. It wasn't a smile of victory or achievement. It was the silent smile of someone who knew she had fulfilled something important, even if no one else acknowledged it. She stopped in front of the flower stand where she bought her daily arrangements, picked a small bouquet of jasmines, and handed it to the vendor with a nod. She walked toward the train station, carrying in her heart a serene certainty. Somehow, even without him knowing, Brandon was back because of her. And that, in itself, was enough. Brandon's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. The first days after waking were filled with intense medical evaluations, continuous testing, and a discreet, controlled rehabilitation focused on neurological and muscular stability. Although his body responded well to stimuli, the real work was happening in his mind. There was an internal fatigue, as if he had carried an invisible weight for weeks. Even without fully understanding why, he felt a constant need for silence, for concentration, for listening to the voices that had filled his world, while he remained trapped in the void between consciousness and darkness. During those initial physical therapy sessions and cognitive tests, one thought remained fixed in his mind: the absence of that voice, which, even without a face, brought him comfort. It was a memory wrapped in fog, yet still real, a delicate presence, almost sacred, that seemed to have sustained his senses while everything else collapsed around him. Amid medication and visual stimuli, the sound of that traditional song resurfaced in his mind, as if it were part of his own history, even though it was entirely foreign to his American upbringing. He couldn't explain it, but the feminine tone singing those unknown words was the only memory that brought him peace. The visits became a controlled parade. Business people, foundation directors, selected journalists, and executives from his own company sought to schedule meetings with the billionaire who had returned from death. Chloe, in turn, made a point of being present at every appearance. She led brief interviews, posted updates with carefully chosen words, and reinforced the image of a loyal and tireless woman. But her gestures didn't fool Brandon. The lack of connection between them was glaring. Nothing in her eyes conveyed truth. Her presence felt artificial, molded by convenience. One day, as the attending nurse organized medical files beside the bed, Brandon, with a hoarse and still weak voice, asked whether anyone had visited him during the coma besides family and official staff. The professional, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression and an ethical demeanor, hesitated for a moment. Then, in a neutral tone, she mentioned that occasionally, during night shifts, a young woman from the cleaning crew would stay in the room for a few minutes. She said that, according to reports from other staff members, the girl didn't cause any disturbances and seemed only to tend to the flowers or tidy the space. There were no official records of her presence, but several colleagues had noticed this pattern. The revelation struck Brandon like a missing piece of his internal puzzle. He showed no immediate emotion, but inside, everything rearranged. That voice, that scent, that calm presence that had enveloped him during the darkest times of his unconsciousness, now had a clearer shape. The once scattered memories began to align. Fragmented images of a feminine silhouette sitting beside his bed, the gentle sound of whispered words, the constant fragrance of jasmine and mint. Small hands adjusting the blanket, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, placing flowers on the bedside table. All of it had happened. It wasn't a hallucination. And more importantly, it hadn't come from Chloe or any other public figure. In the following days, Brandon kept to his rehabilitation routine. He accepted the prescribed exercises, ate well, took supervised walks through the hospital corridors, and attended meetings with his lawyers and advisors. But in his mind, only one objective became increasingly clear: to find out who that woman was, who had sat beside him when everyone else waited for him to wake for their own convenience. He wasn't looking for a pretty face or a grand gesture. He wanted to find the peace that anonymous presence had given him at the most vulnerable moment of his life. In the hospital's administrative wing, no one had detailed information. The cleaning staff worked in shifts, and the daily logs didn't specify who entered which rooms, especially during night shifts. Some names appeared in the reports, but they were just lists of outsourced workers. When Brandon asked for the names to be presented, none of them sparked immediate recognition. Until one late afternoon, during a walk in the inner garden, he caught the same scent of fresh flowers he used to smell in his room. The wind carried the scent of jasmine and mint so strongly that he stopped instinctively. He looked around, but the space was nearly empty. Only one employee, dressed in a simple cleaning uniform, was quietly crossing the side corridor, carrying a bucket and a box filled with small discarded flower pots. She walked naturally, unaware she was being watched. Her hair was tied back, her eyes lowered, Her slim body moved with lightness, almost without a sound. Brandon followed her with his eyes until she disappeared through a side door. That night, back in his room, he couldn't sleep. The image of the young woman walking through the corridors haunted his mind like an unconfirmed truth. He remembered the song again, the one he used to hear during the early hours when his soul floated on the edge between life and death. The words in a foreign language, the calm whispers, the patient gestures. He knew, with growing conviction, that this woman had been with him, and that without her, he might never have awakened. The following days became a game of patience. Brandon quietly observed every employee who crossed his path. He hoped to recognize that same calm aura, the same subtle grace in their walk, and how they interacted with the space around them. He didn't want a confrontation, nor did he intend to involve the hospital administration in this personal process. It was something of his own, intimate. He only wanted confirmation, the silent reunion with the presence that had saved him from an endless void. Slowly, the pieces kept falling into place. His certainty grew with every step, with each memory rebuilt more clearly. And even though he didn't have the young woman's name or her face clearly engraved in his memory, he already carried within him the indelible impression of what she had done. It wasn't ordinary gratitude. It was something that transcended duty or obligation. It was the recognition of a soul who, without asking for anything in return, chose to stay beside another, even when all hope seemed lost. The days that followed the silent suspicion taking root in Brandon's heart grew as dense as the fog that lingers over the mountains at the end of winter. The hospital routine remained unchanged on the surface. Clinical exams, medical reports, physical therapy sessions, but an undercurrent of tension hovered in every corner of the corridors. Brandon didn't express his suspicions openly, nor did he share with the doctors or advisors what he had intuited. His behavior became more introspective, his gestures more restrained, and his gaze, once clouded with confusion, now reflected an uncomfortable clarity. Instead of yielding to Chloe's attempts at control, he gradually pulled away from her forced touches, rehearsed words, and constant presence that felt more like the shadow of a woman than the essence of a real companion. Her visits no longer made an impression. He no longer responded with attentive looks or polite nods. He would sit in the chair in his room, eyes fixed on the window, letting time pass without making any effort to sustain the false narrative of a romantic reunion. Chloe noticed the change, but chose to ignore the signs, believing that in time he would once again succumb to her charm, even if it was artificial. She increased her presence in the corridors, doubled her posts on social media, and began organizing discreet meetings with advisors, attempting to turn Brandon's recovery into a carefully scripted spectacle. However, Brandon, increasingly certain of the charade, decided to act. He called the hospital administration, requested access to internal records, and used the power that his name and wealth afforded him to obtain the list of all staff who had worked in the ward during the critical days. His focus wasn't on the doctors or nurses, but on those whose names usually went unnoticed. He analyzed reports, compared dates, observed patterns. Silently, he identified the night shift during which the presence of that unknown woman had frequently recurred. And although the name Lily appeared among many others, something within him recognized that combination of consonants and vowels with strange intensity. He kept that information to himself and shared it with no one. In the quiet of his room, he decided it was time to put an end to the facade constructed around him. The next day, Chloe appeared as usual, wearing a dress that imitated mourning and sophistication, made up in discreet tones, bearing an expression of artificial tenderness. She approached Brandon and spoke about a new philanthropic project she intended to launch in his name, and described how much she had suffered during the months he had remained unconscious. She used words like dedication, hope, and faith, as if they were precious gems strung together in a necklace of intentions. But Brandon, observing the exact movement of her lips and the exaggeratedly calculated gestures of her hands, did not react. When she finished speaking, he stood up, walked over to the table where a small notebook rested, and without saying a word, showed her the page on which he had written a single sentence. "If you had truly been with me, I would have known." Chloe didn't understand at first. She tried to laugh it off, change the subject, attributing it to recovery stress. But when she realized he was slowly turning away, that his eyes held no anger, only deep disappointment, She felt the foundation she had built begin to crumble. She still tried to argue, appealed to forged memories, spoke of sleepless nights and old promises. She said she had done it all for love, that no one else would have stayed the way she did. But Brandon, his eyes fixed on the open window, remained silent. He knew none of it was real. Nothing in her tone of voice, her cold presence, her impatient gestures matched the peace he had felt when he was most vulnerable. It had all been a performance, and he finally understood the extent of the manipulation he had endured. He sat down, opened a book resting on the table, and slowly turned its pages, ignoring any further attempts she made to regain control of the situation. The bond, if it ever existed, had been severed with surgical precision in that very moment. That same day, on the other side of the hospital, Lily discreetly handed in her resignation letter to the administrative office. She didn't give a reason. She simply stated that, for personal reasons, she needed to step away from the position immediately. She left her badge on the desk, gathered her few belongings, and walked through the hospital corridors one last time, with the same steady, quiet steps that always defined her. She didn't seek out Brandon, didn't try to see him one last time. She knew that any contact at that moment could compromise everything she had preserved until then: the integrity of the gesture, the purity of the presence, the absence of hidden intentions. Instead of seeking recognition, she chose to disappear. She stopped by the flower stand in front of the hospital, picked a small bouquet of fresh jasmines, tied a folded note between the stems, and asked that it be delivered to room 408 the next morning. The message was brief, written in firm, precise handwriting. Sometimes, what saves you doesn't need to stay. Just pass through. After that, she walked through the city's busy streets as if dissolving her own story into anonymity. She caught a bus to the central station, boarded a regional train, and disappeared into the moving landscapes, carrying only a small backpack and the certainty that she had fulfilled what her heart had asked of her. She didn't look back. She didn't hesitate. She knew that any return would break the subtle enchantment she had built with so much silence and truth. When Brandon received the bouquet the next morning, he immediately recognized the scent. He touched the petals as one touches the skin of a secret. He read the note slowly, more than once. No signature, no clue. But there, in that small piece of paper tied to the stem of a simple flower, he found more truth than in all of Chloe's speeches, more presence than in all the supervised visits, more sincerity than in all his past relationships. He placed the note in the nightstand drawer, leaned back in the armchair, and allowed himself to breathe more deeply. He realized then that he had been healed by someone who didn't want applause, someone who had known how to stay when everyone else walked away, and who, at the right moment, knew how to leave without a sound. The peace he had searched for during his days of rehabilitation wasn't found at the end of an explanation or in the center of a public photograph. It was there, in the space left behind by a quiet presence that had done more for him than any other human being in his life. He needed nothing else. He simply closed his eyes and felt, for the first time since waking up, that the truth didn't need proof. It simply existed, and that was enough. After the morning he received the jasmine bouquet with the brief, silent note, Brandon felt compelled by something that transcended logic or convention. Although he said nothing to the medical team or the press who awaited him daily, he asked the on-duty nurse, the one who had mentioned the quiet young woman on the night shifts, if, by chance, she knew where that employee lived or spent time after her shifts. The woman hesitated, but faced with the calm and firm tone of the billionaire who had been saved by something invisible to the eye, she gave in and said that the young woman occasionally mentioned visiting a community garden on the outskirts of the city, a simple space where she tended to vegetables and flowers alongside her grandmother. Brandon thanked her, put on simple clothes, leaving behind suits, luxury watches, and even his armored car, and decided to go there on his own. He declined any security or driver, wanting to find that presence with the same simplicity with which she had touched him. No filters, no theater, no cameras, no protocol. The journey across the city, made mostly on foot and finished with a modest taxi ride, already disconnected him from everything that symbolized his former routine. The skyscrapers were left behind. The event invitations, the business contracts, the obligations that pressed him even in his sleep, all of it lost weight in the face of the silent purpose growing with every step. When he arrived in the neighborhood, he realized that the garden was tucked behind a small community center, surrounded by modest homes and tree-lined streets. The wooden gate was slightly open, allowing a soft breeze to pass through, carrying the scent of damp earth and freshly planted flowers. Brandon walked through the entrance unhurriedly, feeling his body respond to the environment with unexpected lightness. The city's noise gave way to bird song and the muffled sound of water trickling from a hose. There, in the center of the small space surrounded by ceramic pots and colorful flower beds, Lily was watering the plants with calm, steady movements. She wore simple clothes, her hair tied back in a practical bun, and beside her, an elderly woman with a serene expression was arranging small seedlings in reused boxes. The scene was so ordinary and yet so powerful that Brandon felt time slow down. He didn't need to announce his presence. Lily noticed him without surprise, as if she had already expected that moment, even without planning it. He walked over in silence, took a single jasmine flower, the same one she had left with the note, now dried but still intact, from the inside pocket of his coat, and held it out to her. The gesture, simple and wordless, carried everything he had felt since waking: gratitude, recognition, connection, and above all, truth. She took the flower gently, lowered her gaze for a moment, then lifted it again, and in that silent exchange, both understood that something had come full circle. Brandon felt there was no need to explain anything. The entire journey, from the hospital to that garden, from the absence of that voice to the fragmented reconstruction of memory, was already contained in the gesture. When she accepted the flower with trembling hands, he simply murmured a sentence that required no reply. "You woke me up from the coma, and from the life I was living." That was all that needed to be said. There was no need for more. Instead of long explanations, justifications of feelings, or promises of the future, Brandon simply stepped forward and embraced Lily in a firm, genuine hug filled with restrained emotion. It wasn't a romantic gesture in the conventional sense, but a meeting of souls that had touched beyond the surface. She returned the hug with a subtle squeeze, and in that silent contact, something profound was revealed. He wasn't just hugging a woman, he was embracing the peace he had been searching for years. And she, feeling the body marked by pain, yet present by choice, understood that she hadn't cared for him out of pity or impulse, but because she recognized in his fragility something that existed within her too. The moment lasted just long enough to seal what needed to be understood between the two. When they stepped apart, they didn't say anything. Lily returned to tending the plants beside her grandmother, as if nothing had changed. Brandon sat on a nearby stone bench, watching her movements with respect and serenity. He stayed there for hours, breathing the clean air of that place forgotten by the world, but sacred to him. For the first time in a long while, he felt no need to control anything. He didn't have to impress, manipulate, prove, or defend. He simply existed in that moment, and that was enough. As the sun began to set, he stood, looked at Lily one last time, and gave a discreet wave. She returned it with a soft smile, and everything remained suspended there, like a silent promise that required no rush, no words, no certainty. It was enough for each of them to carry within the memory of that reunion, not as an ending, but as a beginning that was possible, calm, and true. The sky over Mumbai turned golden and pink that late afternoon, as if the city itself had chosen to end the day with the same gentleness with which Brandon silently said goodbye to Lily in the garden. He returned to the hospital with slower steps, not out of weakness, but from lightness. His stay there didn't last much longer. In the days that followed, he requested discharge, signed the papers with the determination of someone who knew exactly what he wanted to leave behind, and dismissed the cameras that insisted on following him. He canceled the press conference his team had prepared, called off public appearances, and for the first time in decades, ignored the alerts blinking on his phone. There was no statement, no official note, only silence. And it was within that silence that he made the decision to step away from the city, from the empire he had built, from the contracts that had kept him prisoner to an image that no longer reflected who he had become. He chose to spend time away, and that time wasn't defined by a deadline, but by a need. He bought a simple house on the outskirts of a village a few hours away, a place where mornings began with bird song and ended with the scent of flowers blooming in the night. Without fanfare, he began to rebuild his days. He planted trees in the backyard, learned to cook local dishes with fresh ingredients, read books he never would have touched before, listened to music that spoke to the soul, and above all, cultivated silence. The same silence that, in the hospital, had touched him through Lily's invisible presence. He didn't need to seek her out. He knew what they had shared wasn't a story with a marked ending or predictable encounters. She continued her routine with her grandmother, returned to her studies, and gradually moved closer to her dream of becoming a nurse. No promises were made, no forced future drawn. They each continued on their paths, but with the certainty that, at some point in time, their destinies might cross again, and if they did, it would be for the same reason that brought them together, the truth that blooms in the smallest actions. Meanwhile, the memory of that first touch, of the hug in the garden, of the flower handed over without words, remained alive in every gesture Brandon cultivated from then on. He visited the garden once a week, even when she wasn't there. He sat on the same stone bench and observed the flower beds, now greener and more vibrant. The space still held the fragrance of the mornings, when Lily watered the plants and told stories to the wind. Time passed unhurriedly, and he learned to live with less urgency and more presence. He no longer sought answers where he once demanded control. He understood that what was essential didn't need to be explained or defined. It only needed to be lived. On one of the calmest late afternoons of that year, he sat under the shade of a tree in the backyard of his new home. A soft breeze carried the sound of a familiar melody from afar. It was the same song he had heard in the hospital, when he still couldn't open his eyes. The music seemed to emerge from the walls of time, like a distant echo, and in that moment, he understood that some presences become eternal, even when they are no longer visible. The world around him slowed down, and he closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the song to wrap around him completely. There, in that instant, he realized with clarity that the real miracle wasn't waking from a physical coma, but waking up to an existence where feeling mattered more than having, and where silence said more than all the words ever could. On the darkened screen of memory, as if life itself were closing one chapter to begin another, a gentle phrase appeared, whispered between musical notes and the rustling of leaves. Sometimes, true love is born from the simplest gestures, and it is precisely there, in the silence, that miracles happen. The fade-out followed the final chords of the song Lily used to sing, and the darkness of the final screen didn't bring sadness, but a sense of comfort. It was the kind of darkness that doesn't erase. It protects, preserves, and holds what needs to bloom at the right time. A silent, yet powerful message remained alive there, in every watered flower, in every calm step, in every gesture, without an audience. Because sometimes all a heart needs is a moment of peace to finally recognize love.